Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we're going to be looking at a 10-game Major League Baseball slate that starts at 7 o'clock. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? We do have a couple weather issues in Chicago for the Cubs game and for the St. Louis game. I don't think those weather issues are really going to affect much, but the temperatures in those games will be a bit lower than most of the other games because of the rain, so do keep that in mind, but I don't expect too much change from a fantasy perspective from that. Overall, though, this slate does feature a lot of high scoring games. We have the Cubs game with a 10 run over under. The Colorado game has a 10.5 run over under. And we also have Atlanta at 9, Texas at 9, and then Kansas City, Toronto at 8.5. So, yeah, there's a few games that are pretty low, like the Mets in San Francisco and the Minnesota Twins and Chicago White Sox. But overall, I think this slate is going to be pretty high scoring. We also have decent pitching today. We do have some core plays at pitching finally, which we haven't had in a couple days. And we have several good GPP plays as well. But then we also have some extreme plays. There is a lot of bad pitchers today as well, but it's going to be a fairly interesting slate in general. With that said, let's go ahead and get into it here. We are going to start with our pitching here, and my two top plays for pitching are Rodriguez for Baltimore against the Angels. He's been pretty solid in all the games he's played so far this season. His K rate has been pretty good, and I think he's going to have a lot of upside in this one. He's got the best K rate on the slate. There's not a ton of strikeout potential on this entire slate, so he's one of the better options. He does have more earned runs against than a couple of the other pitchers, but I don't think that that's going to be too much of an issue today. If he gives up one or two earned runs, that'll be okay with him getting 6 or 7 strikeouts here, and I think that will be a very good thing he can do. He also scored 30 fantasy points against the Angels a couple games ago, and he did good last year against them as well, though he did have one bad game against them. But overall, I think he's a solid play on the slate, and he's definitely worth a look. Looking at Lopez for the Minnesota Twins, he's got the overall best matchup here. He's also one of the better strikeout pitchers on the slate. Now, he had one bad game against Cleveland where he only got 2 strikeouts, and then he had a rough game where he got 7 strikeouts against Detroit, but he didn't score that many fantasy points because he gave up 5 earned runs. I don't expect him to give up as many earned runs as that one, so I think a 6 or 7 strikeout game and a couple earned runs is definitely the likelihood. He does tend to give up some home runs this season so far, so that is a little bit of a concern. But I think he's got one of the highest upsides on the slate outside of Rodriguez, and he's a very good option. And he's not the most expensive choice either. Granted, he is up there; he's in the top 3. So as for GPP plays, I do think Stroman's a GPP play, but I don't love him today because he doesn't have that. His strikeout rate has been very inconsistent. Now he started the season pretty good, but the last 2 games he really didn't get a lot, and the strikeouts are just inconsistent. And even though Oakland is a team that doesn't really score a ton, I do think this game is going to be a little bit higher scoring than it normally would be, and so I think he's a little bit more avoidable as a result. Like I said, we want strikeouts in fantasy, and I just don't think that Stroman is going to be the guy today. But he is a GPP play. Looking at Gilbert for Seattle, he's got an extremely tough matchup here against Texas. Texas is a very dominant team, but he has been really solid to start the year. But he has had a relatively easier schedule. Not the easiest, but he's had a tough, a mid-level schedule so far, and he's managed some good games. And so he's definitely capable. He's also one of the better strikeout pitchers on the entire slate. But the matchup is really where he gets the GPP tag from, because if he was in a better matchup, he would definitely be a core play. That matchup is not ideal. Looking at Logan Webb for San Francisco against the Mets. Now, I do think that the Mets are probably one of the worst teams to look at today, and Webb is a pretty good pitcher, and I think he's a GPP play on this one. The strikeout rate is what concerns me. He's not had more than 5 in any game so far this year, but he does have, 18 to 21 fantasy point potential in this game. And if he can limit the earned runs, which he does have tendency to do, he can be okay here. The Mets don't stack up very well against him, so that is an advantage here. But he definitely carries a little bit of risk. Looking at Gosman for Toronto against Kansas City. I don't love this game, but I do think he's a GPP play on it. His strikeout stuff can be good at times, though he's really struggled to start the year with 2 really terrible games against the Yankees and Colorado. But he has had a couple okay games as well, and I think he can have an okay game here. That's his upside, but he's definitely riskier. I do think we have some extreme GPP plays as well, and that would be the next group of pitchers: and Waka, Farid, Severino, Blackburn, and Fetty, and then also King as a kind of a Hail Mary play, and Dunning as a Hail Mary play. Dunning gets the benefit of the best matchup from the cheap guys, and then King has the Hail Mary against Colorado. But I do like Colorado a little bit more today than I did yesterday. And then obviously Fetty, Blackburn, Severino, Freed, and Waka. They all have that potential, but they don't have a huge strikeout rate, and they're probably just extreme plays on the slate. Let's go ahead and get into our catchers today. We have a lot of good options at the catching position. Typically, I hope that there's a 3 or 4 guys at this position, but today I got over 5. The top overall guy is Cal Raleigh for Seattle. He's got a great matchup here against Texas, and he's going to have some good potential. Obviously, Seattle's not the not typically a team that you want to utilize at times, but he's got a good matchup here. Even though Dunning is an extreme play from a pitching perspective, I think that Cal Raleigh is one of my favorite choices at the catching position on the slate. Yanir Diaz is a contrarian option off of him. He's a little bit more expensive too, but he's been pretty solid to start the year, and so I do like him here. And then Luis Campesino is also a great option here against Colorado at Colorado. He did well yesterday, and he was my favorite catcher yesterday, and he was one of the better catchers on the slate, even though he didn't hit a home run. I think he's in a good spot again. And then obviously we could also look at 2 other contrarian options with Contreras. See, from Seattle. He looks pretty solid today. A little bit of a contrarian option here, and then Travis d'Arnaud for Atlanta. If you go with an Atlanta stack, then you can definitely stack up d'Arnaud. He has been absolutely on fire the last 3 of the last 4 games with home runs in all of them. So he has some very fantastic upside in this game as well. Looking at first base, I do like several guys here. In fact, this is a very deep first base position. And you can pretty much go cheap for the most part with Goldschmidt being the top overall guy. Now, he has struggled to start the season, but it looks like he's getting hits in 3 of the last 3 games, and he may be finally starting to get his groove going. He also hit a home run yesterday, so he has some upside today in a plus matchup here. He's got really good metrics for this game against Henry from Arizona. I also like Jake Cronenworth as a kind of value play here for San Diego. Uh, he didn't do much yesterday, but I do think he can bounce back and have a big game today, and so he's definitely worth a look. Vlad Jr. is a good alternative here at $4,700. He's also been pretty solid recently, but he has some ups and downs so far this year. Lamar Wade Jr. Is somebody I really like a lot today as well. His metrics really jump off the page for San Francisco. Uh, he had a really good game 2 games ago against Arizona, but I think he's going to have a couple hits in this game, and he's definitely worth a look. And then Jose Abreu and Alex Kirilloff, they are both kind of good value plays for this slate at this position, kind of Hail Mary options for you. But a lot of good choices there at first base. Second base, a little bit riskier today, and there's not a ton of value, but because Altuve is the top overall guy, he's been absolutely fantastic to start the year, hitting 351 with 5 home runs. I look for him to continue to hit the ball well here in this matchup. He's got a very favorable situation, so he's definitely worth a look. Xander Bogaerts also for San Diego. He's been inconsistent, but he has good upside in this game, and he's had a couple of straight games with some hits, so I think he's uh, got some stolen base potential today as well. So I do think he is an upside play on this one, though he's fairly expensive. And then obviously Keto Marte, he's been absolutely phenomenal to start the year. And he's got good home run potential. He's had 3 home runs he's had some home run potential this game. He hadn't had a home run in a few games, but I think he's in a good spot, and he's definitely worth a look. A couple of value plays here. Polanco for Seattle. I do like Polanco, even though he has not been particularly great to start the year. He's got to try to get some hits here. And then Nico Hoerner for the Cubs. I think the Cubs are a very sneaky stack. Now, Hoerner has been somewhat inconsistent so far, but he does have some good hitting metrics for this game. And then Eduardo Julian is kind of a Hail Mary play from Minnesota here as a cheap option. So, and he hit the ball pretty well yesterday. If you paid attention, he's been hitting the ball very good in certain situations, and this is definitely a good one. Looking at third base, we do like Austin Riley today. Austin Riley looks like a very phenomenal play. Now he has struggled some to start the year, but this matchup is really good for him, and he draws really favorable metrics. I also like Morel for the Cubs. He has also been inconsistent to start the year, but he also has very favorable matchup metrics, and he's a little bit cheaper. Kind of helps you pay down. And then if Dubon was to actually get the start today for the Houston Astros, He would be somebody that I would consider at this position. He can also play in the outfield as well, so he's got multiple situational potential. I also like Alex Bregman for Houston. I think Houston has a viable stack here. Bregman has really struggled to start the year, but he's had some good games, and he's definitely capable of that here. And then also Graham Polly for San Diego. If he ends up drawing the start today, he'll have some kind of Hail Mary opportunity on this slate. Maybe the shortstops. I do think that shortstop is probably a position you could pay up at, but I don't really love it. I mean, you could pay for Bobby Witt Jr. I don't love him here, but I do think he's a good play. I just think there's too many good value plays that you can pay down for, and you don't have to pay up for him. So a couple of them being Pena for Houston, another option from the Houston stack. He's been really solid, and I think he's got really good upside in this matchup. He's been playing very well to start the year. Kim for San Diego, also a very interesting play here against Colorado. Swanson for the Cubs also fits in as a great spot here, and then J.P. Crawford for Seattle also looks very good here. There's just a lot of different ways you could attack this, and they're all cheap. You could also look at Gunnar Henderson and Bo Bichette, but they are a little bit more expensive, so they're probably not the biggest must plays, but I think that they have some value as well on the slate. Moving to the outfielders, we have 4 top tier plays, and Acuna, Tatis Jr., Jordan Alvarez, and Juan Soto. If I would probably pick at least one of those guys to try to be in your lineup if you can afford them. I do think Tatis Jr. probably has the most upside being this in San Diego, but I do like the other options as well. And then Cody Bellinger is kind of a contrarian play, and he's a little bit cheaper at $4,900, so he's definitely worth a look. But as for value plays, we'll look at Chas McCormick. For Houston, he's nicely cheap today, and I think he draws a lot of potential in this game. He hadn't hit a home run yet this year, but he's got good metrics for this one. Dubon can also play here in the outfield, so I do like him a lot here too. Lee for San Francisco is kind of a one-off play. He looks like a pretty interesting play on this one. He's been hitting the ball pretty well lately, and I think he has some potential in this one to have a big game. Wade Jr. is another guy. He plays at first base. I already mentioned he can play here in the outfield as well. Springer is also somebody that's interesting from Toronto. I also like Profar from San Diego, who was one of my favorite plays yesterday, and he did okay, and I think he's got a pretty good matchup here again, but it's not quite as good as yesterday. He scored 7 fantasy points. I think a 7 to 10 fantasy point game is definitely in play for him again, though. Buxton is also in play for Minnesota. Kirilloff for Minnesota can play first base or outfield as well. Merrill for San Diego, and then Wyatt Langford for Texas. I'll have some upside today. So let's go ahead and look at our stacks here. We have quite a few options stack-wise. Now, more than we've had in a while, to be honest, I feel like. So we have pretty much 7 teams that are very stackable today, and we have another 5 teams that have some decent stacks, and then we have some value. Then we have some riskier stacks at the bottom here. But Seattle, Houston, and San Diego are the top overall stacks, then followed by Texas, Arizona, Toronto, and Atlanta. All these stacks have some upside, and I do like them quite a bit. San Diego has a good boost to the lefties. Houston has a boost to the righties. Texas has a boost to the righties, and so does Atlanta has a boost to the righties. I think all these stacks, I'm going to probably try to make lineups with all these different stacks in it. Just trying to make different things and see if I can get a couple good ones. But I definitely like the, Seattle stack is actually pretty good because it's cheap. The Houston stack is pretty expensive, but they got some cheap options to throw around with it. It's going to be hard to stack San Diego because they're pretty expensive, but if you go with the back end of the stack, then you have some potential there. Texas also has some good options, though very expensive. Arizona stack is very expensive. Toronto stack is actually not too expensive, but it's kind of risky. And then Atlanta has a good expensive stack, but they do have some value plays that can help alleviate some of that. Looking at the next 5 teams of Seattle, Baltimore, Cubs, Minnesota, and Oakland, I think this Cubs stack is going to be underutilized, and so that's definitely going to be interesting with Horner, Bellinger, Morel, and Swanson. I think with the boost of the righties, too, that's going to help some of those guys. For Baltimore, Henderson, O'Hearn, Santander, Mullins, I think that's a pretty interesting stack, but you could pretty much just roll out anybody in Baltimore for a chance today. Then looking at St. Louis, I do think that's got a pretty decent stack today, but I think Goldschmidt is my favorite play from that team, and he's one of my favorite plays on the entire slate. Looking at Minnesota, Kirilloff and Julian and Larnach are probably the top overall guys. Buxton's the next guy. and then there's some cheap options to kind of round one out. And for Oakland, I think they could be sneaky today with Belede, Brown, and Geloff being the possible options today. But I do think most of those guys are one-off options. Then at the bottom side here, we do have some guys that have some upside, but these teams are very risky to stack, but they do have some potential. I do like the San Francisco stack with Lee, Wade Jr., Conforto, Yastrzemski, and Estrada, and maybe even Ahmad. It's not an expensive stack, so you can definitely do it. And then obviously with Kansas City, I do think that Witt Jr. is the best option on the team, but they're pretty avoidable. I do think this is probably a group of games I'm mostly going to avoid unless for one-off situations. But like the first guy on each of these stacks are probably your best one-off option from those teams. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking.